thank you all that you're here tonight. I'm so pleased to see so many join us. And whether you're just starting an endowment, whether you have one in place, I think we have something for all of you tonight. My job at the Episcopal Church Foundation is program manager for endowment management solutions. And what that means is basically I work the continuum of service from the structure of your endowment, to the investment options, to the growth of the endowment through plan giving. And we can help you at any point along that continuum to reach your goals for endowment management. I'm joined tonight by Lynn Mander. Lynn, we've recently brought Lynn on, and I'm pleased to have her join us. Lynn comes to us from a banking background, a lot of investment experience, also experience on Wall Street, a wealth of experience in endowment management, portfolio management, understanding the needs of clients. She also is an active member of St. Peter's in Malvern, Pennsylvania, where I first met her and noticed her. She was on their endowment committee and was asking a lot of pertinent questions. She also, by the way, sits on the CFA exam group. So if you're looking for a CFA, she's the person to be in touch with, to know. Anyway, we're pleased to have Lynn with us, and she'll be talking later on to some specific subject matter that we'll come to. But first of all, endowments are becoming an important aspect of our church stewardship. For many churches, they already are. And given the number of calls that I get, the number of churches who are interested in endowments is growing enormously. Endowments are unique creations because they reflect the generosity of past generations, and they challenge the skill of the current generation to manage those funds responsibly, and they invite the congregation to have a vision for the future. If you don't have an endowment, I would say, or a well-organized endowment, you're committing two sins at once. One is, the more obvious one, is you're depriving your church of potential resources for ministry. But the less obvious one is that you're depriving your donors, potential donors, of an opportunity to make a meaningful gift to your congregation. And so whenever I go around and talk in dioceses, I will say that no matter how large your congregation, no matter how small your congregation, whether you have any money at all, you need an endowment structure in place. If you don't have an endowment structure, you're probably not going to have an endowment. So you need to get started by putting that structure in place. And it's your job to put together a well-organized, well-invested, and well-spent endowment. Sounds pretty simple. In many respects, it is, but there are many aspects to it that touch on many kinds of issues that we will come to. Tonight we're going to talk about what an endowment is, why have one, what principles support a well-managed endowment, and what policies you need to put in place. We'll cover a lot of territory tonight, so you're not going to have to absorb everything, but I want to make it clear that I'm available to talk to you individually and specifically about your endowment in the months or the weeks to come. Please call me or send me an email. I do this on a regular basis. We'll take questions from time to time. You can put in the chat message, and we'll also send you a set of our sample endowment policies and guidelines. These have been developed over the years, have been vetted, have been worked through each time. We work with a church, not every time, but often we learn something new and we reflect it in those documents. So I would commend them to you. They come as a Word document, which allows you to modify them for your particular church. To start out then, to talk about endowments, I'm going to give you, talk about four fundamental principles of endowment and 4 bad examples that illustrate those principles. First, the question of purpose. Why an endowment? I had a church that called me and they said, okay, here's the size of our congregation, here's our annual budget, and how large do you think our endowment should be? Do I have a rule of thumb? And I said, well, I have a question for you. I said, if you're using the endowment to supplement the annual operating budget of the parish, then the answer is pretty obvious. You just do a little math. You take a rolling 3-year average value of your endowment, you multiply by 3 or 4%, come up with a number. Is that sufficient? If it's not, then you need a larger endowment. But what's the point? Where is the vision in that? If the endowment is to be used for something other than propping up the annual budget, then there's no limit for its size, nor is there any argument as to whether or not it is diminishing annual stewardship. Second principle is perpetuity. The word endowment itself implies perpetuity, yet there are far too many churches that are spending down the corpus of their unrestricted endowment to meet current operating expenses. Example is the church I met with at the time had about a $600,000 endowment, and they had come to me several years later and said, we want to do a campaign, or we want to go out to some of our donors and try to raise more money. I said, where do you stand today? And he said, well, we have about $300,000. I said, $300,000? What happened to the difference? And they said, well, we came up short on the annual operating budget, and so we had to dip into the corpus to make ends meet. And they were going back to the same donors that had given the first round, and very skeptical, so very difficult to regain that trust. Third one is prudent investing. This is a story of a church that had been invested through the Episcopal Church Foundation. They had maintained about an 80% equity position, that is in our growth fund, which is diversified equities, 20% fixed income, and they maintained that all through 2007 and 2008. If you remember 2008, who can forget it? And so by early 2009, this church came to me and said, look, we can't take it anymore. We want to take all our money out of the growth fund and put it all into fixed income, all into cash, as a matter of fact. And I tried to encourage them not to do that, but they were set to it, and they did it. So what happened was in March of 2009, the market was back. You saw the growth of the fund, and if they had stayed where they were, or even at a 50-50 split, they would have seen a 21% increase in their fund. Instead, they saw less than 1%. And the reason they were able to do that was they didn't have an investment policy statement in place. And so they were, by that means, they were able to make this very emotional decision about where they were going to go and their response to the market. So prudent investing, one of those principles is an investment policy statement. And the fourth principle I would mention is prudent spending. There was a church that contacted me a couple of years back. They had about a $6 million endowment. And in fact, they were so unusual that I went to see them. I heard the rector speak, and he said, you know, we're all about spending the endowment. We don't think we should be sitting on a big pile of money. We want to spend it for ministry. And so instead of using the normal 3 to 5% drawdown, they were going to spend down 12, 15% a year and make it up through new gifts. Wow, okay. And so about 3 years later, I got a call from the vestry member and he said, hey, look, we're in trouble here. You need to come see us. Because what had happened is their endowment had gone through the 2008 decline, and instead of drawing down 10, 15, they were going to 20, 25, 30%, all going for their annual operating budget. And so what had been $6 million was now $2 million, and dropping fast. So bad decisions all around, but good examples of some of the core issues that you're going to have to deal with. First off, and I can change this, Um, what is an endowment fund? Very basic stuff. Endowment fund is a long-term fund set aside, invested with restrictions to provide a reliable source of income for the church over time, and only a portion is spent every year. It's in its most basic form. And within endowment, there are two fundamental types of endowments. There's the true endowment and the quasi-endowment. And the difference is the source of the money. And what I mean by that is if a donor gives a gift to your church and designates it for the endowment fund, then that gift is restricted and is meant to be managed in perpetuity. If the donor also adds a restriction on its use, you have both a restricted fund in a true endowment, and you have a purpose assigned to it. And you're required by law to fulfill the terms of that gift in perpetuity. That's what makes up a true endowment. And the other way that a true endowment can be established is if the board, the vestry, the church, promotes the endowment within the church and says, okay, we have an endowment, it's a true endowment, and people give with that understanding, that money is equal. If you have a quasi-endowment, is this other type of endowment you could have. And that's if the board or the vestry receives funds from sale of property, or say they receive an unrestricted request, or they have excess cash, they decide to put that into the endowment fund. That's an unrestricted money because they could have spent it at the outset in any way they chose, but they chose to put it in the endowment fund. And so it will be unrestricted. It will remain unrestricted for the entire life of the fund. Most vestries, when they put money into an endowment, even if it's unrestricted, they intend to manage it as a true endowment and maintain the corpus of the fund. But current vestries can't restrict future vestries from dipping into the corpus, which is why we offer some policies that will help you protect the corpus of the unrestricted endowment. And speaking of, again, think of those two columns of unrestricted and restricted funds. Restricted funds are protected, the corpus is protected by what's called UPMIF, and we'll get to that a little bit later. It's the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act. It's a state law that affects all nonprofits with regard to spending from a true or restricted endowment. The unrestricted endowment is protected only by whatever policies you put in place at the local church level. And we recommend at least a 2/3 vote of the vestry at 2 consecutive meetings, and possibly a 2/3 vote of the full congregation to dip into the corpus of the unrestricted endowment. So to make it difficult but not impossible. What an endowment is not. An endowment is not a collection of trusts. I was with a church in Virginia and asked the question, do they have an endowment? They said, oh yeah, we have an endowment. I said, okay, if I want to give to that endowment, how could I do that? And they sort of looked at each other and they couldn't come up with a good answer, because what they had was a collection of old trusts that were considered an endowment. They were throwing off income to the church, but there was no way for somebody to give to the endowment fund or to give for a particular purpose. So what they have is a collection of trusts. An endowment is not short-term reserves. By that I mean you may have a reserve fund for the organ, you may have it for kitchen repair, something like that. They should not be invested in your long-term investment strategies. There was a church with us last year that had decided to contribute to a capital campaign, and that money was going to be used up in the first 6 months of the year. So we immediately, upon hearing that, we immediately took that money out of the long-term strategies and sent it back to the church and put it in local CDs in a local money market, because once you discern that that the money is going to be short-term, you don't want it to be invested in a long-term strategy, because there's not time for the fund to recover from market decline. And also, it's not an invested fund. I know several churches. There was a church that is with us that had about $3 million, and I thought initially that it was an endowment fund, but it wasn't. It was purely an investment fund. Had no real rules around it. The church could dip into it at will without any restraint, and there was no defined purpose to it. And so they came to me and they said, okay, we'd like to start an endowment fund, which kind of surprised me. And then we began to work on that and looking at the question of why did they want an endowment fund and what do they intend to do with it. The big question, why have one to begin with? If you're talking to a regular nonprofit, the answer would probably be we want financial independence. But seeking financial independence through an endowment fund, I think, may very well undermine the very reason why a church exists. Defining that vision that is something beyond the annual operating budget is what will give the fund some life. One of the things that you may not think about is that if somebody is planning to make a legacy gift, they have many options. Your church may be one option, but so are many other options. And I think you need to be able to make the case for why your church deserves to receive someone's legacy gift. The main purpose that underlies the all endowments is that it empowers ministry and not to be used primarily as a savings account to protect against future uncertainties. In fact, I had a record call today. We're setting up a visit down in the southern part of the United States, and this is a church that has about a $6.5 million endowment. And he's a new rector there, and the endowment board is not spending from the endowment. There's no spending taking place, except when they have a particular capital need. They go to the fund, and the fund writes a check for the capital need. But there's no vision, there's no purpose other than I call it a super savings account, that emergency event if they need to do a capital campaign. So it has very little vision, and it's contributing very little to the ministry of the church. We suggest that you use words like endowment fund is a means to enable the church to fulfill its ministry beyond what is possible through the annual operating budget. When the only purpose of an endowment is to supplement the operating budget, it often has a corrosive effect on stewardship. There was an interesting case study that came up last week at the Consortium of Endowed Parishes in Atlanta, and Jim and I were there, and we heard a church talk about their journey. This is a church that has a $22 million endowment, $22 million. And one of the questions you might ask is, how would you encourage people to give to a $22 million endowment? And also, what do you do when 60% of your annual operating budget comes from the revenue derived from the endowment fund? What was interesting in what they presented was they didn't look at that percentage. package. That is, they didn't say, okay, we're at 60% of our annual operating budget. We need to reduce that to 50 to 40 over time and begin to spend it for something else. They looked at what the church was all about, what the church's ministry was, and they said, okay, here's some practical facts. The current program cannot be sustained by the current number of people and the pledges we're receiving. And we believe in the program. I think it's vital to this community. So they came up with a proposal. It was kind of interesting. They said, okay, we're going to fund, through our endowment, key staff positions, capital needs, and certain core programs with a portion of the $22 million. And we're going to set aside the rest for what they called an opportunity fund, which would be used for funding special projects and outreach. Like, for example, they had opened a legal counsel for poor people. They had opened a daycare center for working women and an after-school program. So they were actively using that fund for special opportunities. And what that enabled them to do is to go out to the congregation then and say, okay, we have this fund, and there really is no limit in a sense of what we can do, because there are all kinds of opportunities for what we can do with the endowment. So the more that our endowments are used to support the mission and outreach and special projects, as opposed to the annual operating budget, the more gifts it will attract. What an endowment is not for, as you've heard me say, not to plug holes in the annual operating budget. Try that over in 2008 and find out how many people you might be laying off. It's not a savings account for future emergency like the church in Florida I talked about, but they're just sitting on $6.5 million. And it's not for self-preservation. And I'll give you an example of a church in New England that called, asked. They wanted to start an endowment, of course, and I asked, okay, well, what's the point? Why do you want to do that? They said, well, we're an older congregation, and our parishioners are dying off, and we want to replace their pledges through endowed fund, so they can give the money to the endowment, and that will kick off money to replace their pledges. I said, that's fine. But I said, what's going to happen in 20 years from now? You know, look forward. And what you're going to find is you're going to have a church with lights on, but nobody home. So I think you may want to think about doing something about your program and mission of the church right now, today, as opposed to thinking about preserving your institution. What endowment is for: support ministries beyond the annual operating budget, opportunity fund, and this other idea that I talked about earlier, to provide donors with a trustworthy place to leave their legacy gifts. I think that's an important aspect of what you're doing. Reasons endowments don't grow: lack of structure or reliable structure. That is, the church with trust funds or with no structure whatsoever. An outdated structure. I've come across many of those where current investment policies, current strategies, or even some that are stuck in the old model of income only. In fact, I talked to one in Cayuga 2 weekends ago, where they were confined. They felt they were confined to spending only the income earned by this endowment fund, and of course, investing in fixed income generates very little income these days, right? Less than 1% usually. So this fund was generating very little. So we had a conversation about how the MIFA law, and we'll get to that in a bit, could affect what they could do and how they could actually be able to spend more money from the endowment and fulfill the purpose that the donor originally meant. And of course, no one is asked, that is your planned giving aspect. If you don't ask, you don't receive. Structure. Why structure matters. And I would say this is a critical point. And I would say it's also the first step in any effective planned giving program. If you're going to go out and talk to people about giving a legacy gift to your church, you're going to need to be able to explain how the money will be used, how it will be invested, how much is going to be spent every year, and who's in charge of making those decisions. So the very fundamental structural parts are important to be known. Also, you have fiduciary responsibility to the investors or the people who've given you gifts in the past, and your task is to maintain the spending power of that endowment. And then the other third aspect of this is making sure that the purpose of the endowment is clearly understood in the congregation. So how do you do that? You've decided, you've sorted out, yeah, I want to do an endowment. Yeah, I understand what the general purposes are to this endowment. Okay, let's start working on what do we need for setting up the structure of the endowment. Here's the set of policies that I'm going to send you. It's the first two items here is the enabling resolution, which the vestry passes, and it's the operating policies that the endowment committee puts in place with the blessing of the vestry. What we recommend here is a committee of the vestry. We do not recommend establishing a separate 501c3 organization to manage the endowment funds of a church. We can go into some detail on that at another time, but just basically our recommendation is to use the committee of the vestry. What happens when you have a separately incorporated nonprofit established to manage the fund? That oftentimes, that is, you have people with power and money, and sometimes they don't talk to one another. And I'm dealing with several of the churches right now where people actually make an application to the endowment committee for a project, and the endowment committee awards the grants without any consultation to the vestry, and that's causing some friction. And that plays out in a variety of ways. So the best solution, I think, is for you to establish a committee of the vestry. In that enabling resolution, which is the first one that the vestry passes, it establishes a purpose, and it also decides who's going to be on the committee and how they get on the committee, the endowment committee. And we build in checks and balances here. People on the endowment committee are not people that are responsible for the annual operating budget. So we exclude from membership on the committee the rector, the senior warden, the treasurer of the church, all of whom need to deal with that annual operating. And we're looking for people who have a longer-term view for managing the long-term assets of the church. The protection of the corpus. In the policies, we talk about using a total return spending rule, but applying that to both the restricted and unrestricted, and we'll get into that in a little bit more. And we also talk about dispersing the funds, that is how you go through the process to determine how much to spend, how much money is available for expenditure, and then who gets to make those decisions. And again, we differentiate between the responsibilities of the endowment committee, which is to manage the investment of the funds and to determine how much to be spent, and then that message is carried to the vestry, which decides within the purposes agreed upon what the priorities will be in that particular year. We also put in place the rules that will set a fairly high bar for churches wanting to dip into the unrestricted portion of the endowment. We say a 2/3 vote of the vestry at 2 consecutive meetings, a 2/3 vote of the congregation to dip into the corpus of the unrestricted endowment. The other policies we're talking about, operating policies, the investment policy statement, I referred earlier to the importance of having that. disposition of bequest policy. I had a call today about this, where a church is receiving an unrestricted bequest and is using it to sort of flow into the annual operating budget or spend immediately. And what this policy says is that the default position of a church is that an unrestricted bequest will automatically go into the endowment fund of the church unless, and then there's a conversation between the rector, the senior warden, and the vestry to decide, yeah, we're going to put some or all or none into the endowment fund. Because once you get in the endowment fund, then you have other restraints on using it. We also have a spending rule and how you apply that. And we also have gift acceptance policies. And this speaks to all those kinds of non-cash gifts that you may receive, such as a gift of real estate, a gift of life insurance, a gift of an IRA or some other non-cash gift. The other startup considerations I would mention is reserve funds need to be clearly identified and not put in your endowment fund, and your record keeping needs to be very good. By that I mean you want to keep, if you have restricted and unrestricted funds, you want to have sub-accounting to identify what they are. You want to have records of donor restrictions. Too often when you ask, okay, are these funds restricted in any way, the answer is not clear. We have a donor who might have given a gift in the past who told the director they wanted to be used for such and such, or the treasurer, and that is not written down and documented. So it's important to document any donor restriction because other people know. And if you don't use it for the purpose that the donor intended, you're undermining your credibility as an investment group. And you should have your policies on file and accessible to anyone who's looking at the fund or to the committee or the next members of the committee who come along. So those are the policies. These two, the enabling resolution and these 5 operating policies are what we're going to send to you as a Word document. And I encourage you to take a look at them and get back to me with questions, and we'll help you if you need help in refining those for your particular situation. So some key principles in operating, managing an endowment. You need to understand the difference between a true and a quasi-endowment because they're both they're controlled by different aspects. MIFA controls the true in terms of spending. The church policies will control the spending with regard to quasi or board restricted. You can invest as one, that is, you can put both restricted and unrestricted into one investment strategy, but you spend as 2 when it comes down to that last bit. Your task as a committee is to protect the corpus, that is, protect the spending power of the endowment. That is, you're to calculate factors that will influence the spending power of the endowment and to maintain that spending power. And it's important, I think, that you understand UPMIFA, the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, which was passed, has been passed in 49 of 50 states. Pennsylvania, God bless them, has not done it. They have a different law that they haven't passed that speaks to some of these issues, not all. But in all the other states, the UPMIFA law has been passed. It affects restricted funds. I'm going to ask Lynn to step up at this point and speak to some of the sort of fundamental principles of UPMIFA and how it applies to church endowments. Okay, Lynn?
Thank you, Ken. As Ken's mentioned a couple of times here, UPMIFA applies to the donor-restricted funds, or the true endowments. And I think those of us who have had some endowment experience generally think of never touch the principal and only distribute income. And what UPMIFA does is it allows for a total return approach in terms of both investing and spending. But it uses a word called prudent quite often. And prudent is a difficult term because it's really what are other folks doing, what are other endowments doing similar to ours, and are we acting in a prudent manner? Are we being prudent about the costs of our endowment? we being prudent about the spending policies? Are we being prudent about the investment management? And basically, prudent means what would a reasonable person do in this situation? I think one of the situations Ken mentioned earlier with the church that panicked in 09, a lot of people were panicking in 09, going to cash, that could be questioned, and that's why the investment policy is so important in a case like this. So that will be used to guide both the management of the restricted and unrestricted funds. Many of the things that MIFA asks of the donor restricted or true endowments is also good policy for the quasi-endowments. You want to?
Yeah, I would mention that one thing that the church that was spending the income only and feeling restrained by that, what a MIFA does in that respect, it takes away the concept of historic dollar value. I think a lot of people have that stuck in their mind that we can't spend below historic dollar value. What a MIFA says is that no longer matters. Historic dollar value is no longer a principle to be considered. What is to be considered is the maintaining the spending power of the endowment. And how do you do that? Well, you have to calculate, and we'll show you in a minute, your spending rule, which is total return spending rule, factor in inflation, factor in fees, and come up with what you think your fund will do. But we'll get to that in a minute. But where you have income only, that is, if the original gift instrument says you can spend income only, what a MIFA does is it removes that restraint. So even if the original gift instrument says that, you can, as a nonprofit or as a church, can use a total return spending rule if you apply the prudent characteristics that are in the law. And there are 7, I think, of how they define prudent investing and prudent management. And again, I encourage you to go to that www.upmifa.org site to look up the summary of this, and you could even look it up, the detail in your particular state. It's common to, it's a state law, common among most states. I know New York, for example, has a difference in that they say if you spend 7%, that's considered imprudent and rebuttable in court. That is 7% of a rolling 3-year average. Anyway, enough on a MIFA. Back to spending policies.
Well, let me just step back for a little bit here and talk about some of the history of the endowments. And basically, endowments had only distributed income. And if you think back to the markets in the early 80s, late 90s, we had very high inflation, but we also had very high interest rates. So many endowments were heavily invested in bonds for the income, some in only dividend-paying stocks. And what that did was it gave them a good cash flow and a good distribution rate until interest rates started to come down. And at the same time that happened, the stock market started a fairly major bull market for about 20 years. And a lot of these endowments didn't have enough equity investments. If they did, they were maybe in dividend stocks and not looking at a broad diversification of small cap and technology, some of the faster growing sectors. So as this is being reviewed, what the concept came into place of looking at the total return of the endowment. And what that means is not just the income, but any capital gains that are generated from market moves. And then setting a policy of how much of that should we be spending. Usually that's set on an annual basis. It is usually looking back at a 3-year, sometimes 12 quarters, rolling average. And the nice thing about the rolling average is if you do have a big market dip, the distribution rate that can stay the same and the amount won't drop quite as much as the market did. By the same token, it prevents some overspending in the years when the market has done very well. But how do you determine what the correct spending rate is? Ken just mentioned New York has a 7% cap that feels that isn't prudent. In Pennsylvania, it's actually between 2 and 7%, since we have our own rules here. But what you want to do is look at some long-term asset class forecasts. And while that sounds fairly complicated, we do have a good partner helping us with some of those forecasts. If you want to spend 5%, we also have to look at how much you have to add to the return to preserve the spending power. What do you expect the inflation rate to be, and what will those dollars be worth down the road? So we want to take a look at that as well. And actually, they've just switched over here to the calculation slide. So if we look at a 5% spending rate, 2% is a long-term inflation rate, and 1%, which is a reasonable fee, the portfolio, the investment fund, would have to return 8% just to keep even. If you look at the 4% number, you can see now that dropped and then down to 6. So it really it's very, very important to not only look at what the spending rule calculation tells you, what are the long-term forecasts in the market, and what should the asset allocation be. And the spending rule and the asset allocation go hand in hand. If you want a higher spending rate, you may have to take a little bit more risk in the market with higher returning equities versus fixed income where it is today at fairly low rates. Was there anything else on that, Ken? I think I covered everything that we talked about.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think the important point there that you just last made, I think the marriage of the spending rule with your asset allocation. I mean, to take it to an extreme, if you say we're going to draw down 5%, but you're going to invest in primarily in fixed income, you're not going to get there from here. That is, you're going to have to take, in order to get an 8% return, you're going to have exposure to the market. That is the stock market, which is why UPMIFA and prudent management would say you need a diversified portfolio. But where that number is something you work out with your investment advisor based on your risk tolerance, your asset, your long-term time horizon, your income needs. All of those things factor in, and in determining where you put that percentage draw on your annual spending. Long-term forecasts, as you know, fixed income is relatively bleak, has been this past year and the coming years. So we've seen churches try to balance that out on their spending. So this is a calculation that should be done every year. And then whenever that draw is determined, say you could determine a 4% draw, which is where the average really is. Most endowment funds nationally are about 4%. Inflation right now is maybe not 2, right now it's 1, but historically it's been around that 2%. So the question is, you're going to get 7% or 6% drawdown on the fund, or for return on the fund, and that's then a question of, okay, well, will a 60-40 split get there? Will 70-30 be required? And that's where you have that conversation, looking at the long class forecasts. Investing your endowment. A few comments on investments. Your initial decision will be how much equity to fixed income you want to hold. You're encouraged to have a diversified portfolio for all kinds of good reasons. The second important decision is diversification. You have equities and you have fixed income, but within the XV class, you want to have diversification. And that means you want to have large cap, small cap, mid cap, international stocks. You want to have a variety of asset classes or sub-asset classes within the equity portion. Same is true of fixed income. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. You want to be all in U.S. Treasuries. Take a look at maybe other fixed income assets, even high yield. We've included that in our portfolios. Treasury, inflation protected securities, or assets. So diversification is the second principle. You also want to, your choices for investing are several. You can go to a local bank. They will help you out, or a brokerage house like Edmund what's his name, Edward James. Um, what are some of the other ones that you may go to, Lynn?
Well, these days
Morgan,
a lot of them also have bank names on them, but any Morgan Stanley, any money management arm of an investment firm can help.
they'll do that. Some dioceses have investment trust at the diocesan level. You basically invest with the group, and the diocesan finance committee determines how the money will be invested. You're simply a group, and sometimes they will also determine what the payout will be, whether it's a 3% or 4%. Well, usually it's not a lot of involvement on the part of the church in the investment decisions. The Episcopal Church Foundation has options for churches. It's a very good option. I'm biased, but I can tell you the truth. We have investment options for churches under $1 million and churches over $1 million. Under $1 million, you go into a pool with others. If you're over $1 million, you have a customized account. We have about 175 churches and dioceses that are with us, about 130 million under management. What to look for when you look at your investment options? You want to look for the possibility of diversification. You don't want all your money in one stock or just 7 or 8 stocks. You want to be diversified. Be able to measure performance against standard benchmarks. How well are you doing? Well, how do you know if you're doing very well? So you want to have it against a benchmark that you can agree upon. Reporting, you want to have regular reports. Typically, we have a monthly statement. That's an accounting statement that shows the value of the account, shows any money coming in, going out for current asset allocation, so on. And you want to have performance reports. These are typically done on a quarterly basis, where you show how the fund has portfolios against a standard benchmark. What kind of service that is the phone? Is there somebody at the other end of the line that you want to talk to that can give you an answer? And then what kind of fees are you paying? And I would encourage you to take a very careful look at the fees. Oftentimes you'll get a reported fee of management of the fund, the portfolio, but they don't give you the management cost of the fees within the funds they're using. That is, all mutual funds have added and management fees within them. So what you can end up doing is you can pay a manager to help you with the asset allocation, and you can pay a manager to oversee asset class managers, and then the asset class managers pay a fee for the funds they're using. So if you're not careful, you end up paying a stack of fees. So we encourage you to take a good look at that. And we think because what we offer is a collective product or collective group, we're able to get the advantage of lower fees because we're actually investing at the level of $130 million rather than 3 or 4 million or 10,000 for that matter. So we share that benefit with all of you. I'm going to go along toward the end here and then open it up to questions. An endowment will be effective for there are a couple of core principles that you want to keep in mind for effective communications. Record keeping. You need to know donors' wishes, have good reporting to the congregation as to how the funds are returning. You want to be able to explain the concept, that is the idea of an endowment and why you're doing it. And whenever you spend the money, it's important to share the details. I've been in some churches where the endowment fund is simply a line item in the budget of the annual budget of the church, and it just simply feeds in there, and so there's no calling out what was made possible through the endowment. And I would encourage you to call it out and use it as a marketing tool to say, here's what we've done with our endowment in the past year. Do if we had a larger endowment. Also, explaining how to give. This is where Jim and the team at State Street or at ECF can really help you in a number of ways. We have printed resources that will walk you through a year-long plan giving program. We have a 5-step plan giving program from the simplest version of the rector making a statement about the prayer book and what it says in the prayer book about remembering the church in your will, and all the way through a full-blown legacy society, which is recognizing and remembering those who remember the church in their wills. And, of course, thanking your donors. That's critical. It needs to happen regularly and completely. And how do you grow your endowment? Endowments usually grow through a bequest and a will. That's the most significant way that churches grow their endowments. The structure is core, is key to that happening. And using the money. I mean, churches who come to me and say, we want to start an endowment, we only got to have $10,000 to get started with us. We're not going to spend anything until we get to $100,000 because it's not meaningful. I say spend anyway. Go through the exercise of doing the forecasting, doing the drawdown, doing the rolling average, and then spend it and use it for something that you can identify and talk about. Of course, communicate, which is up, and of course say thank you. So in the end, having an endowment will tell you that you have thought about the church's resources in a meaningful way. You provided a resource for the church that speaks to both current situations, and you provided I call it that opportunity fund that I talked to earlier about that church, the $22 million fund. But they had an opportunity fund. You can create an opportunity fund at $10,000, but it's providing a resource for innovative, creative, life-giving ministries for now and for a future we don't even know about 20 years down the road. Jim, back to you for final comments.
Well, thank you, Ken. I really appreciate that, and I should actually probably come back on video too. Thank you for that. And what I'd like to do is draw your attention to a question that's been proposed. Ken, at the bottom, it says, approximately what percentage of Episcopal churches in the U.S. have separate 501c3s managing their endowments? I don't think we ever have had any numbers on that, but have you ever gotten a sense of how many? I would say it's a minority, but Ken, what do you think?
Well, I haven't uncovered every endowment in the Episcopal Church yet, but there are, I'm dealing with a number, I mean, let's take the 175 that are with us. Of those, I would say maybe 10 have separately incorporated endowment board, 501c3. I'm dealing with several.
I would say it's around 10% or so. Generally, from my own experience, it's less than 10% typically, but it's more common in certain parts of the country. For example,
it's true, and it's more from the past. People that have had a longer-term endowment, they are the ones that I see typically have a separate 501c3. But I would say that my experience has been in those instances where I've been dealing with them, in the majority of cases, there have been issues, and we're undoing those issues. And I can name 4 or 5 right now that I've been talking to that have that conflict between the two, and the roles are not clearly defined, or there's no communication, or in some cases they're okay with it, but there's not that sense of common purpose. And set up a 501c3 separately for basically 2 reasons. One, you would try, you are thinking about liability, and you're trying to protect your assets from a potential lawsuit. Very difficult to do that under any circumstances with a good lawyer. But also, you'd have to make it so distinctly different that the vestry would lose control of its money. So in terms of liability, it's not a good solution. Church insurance would be a much better solution.
Yeah.
And the other reason you would set up a 501c3 is to protect the corpus and more distinct and separate from the vestry so that they don't overspend. But
I
that
would
in
I
other
would
ways.
also add, Ken, and this is something that our attorney in the past had always said, when you divide money from mission, it just causes confusion. And speaking from a planned giving perspective, since this isn't a planned giving webinar, planned givings are very emotional and devoted gifts that people are giving. And they typically want to give it to the parish and to the parish's future mission and ministry. And unfortunately, if there's a totally separate foundation, there may be some natural confusion about what the foundation does and how it exists and how it runs itself. And so people may automatically be confused and choose not to give. So my own experience, Ken, I think yours is the same. The majority of um, foundations are created well and have a large endowment to begin with, but typically don't grow because either they don't communicate well or there's confusion among donors. And since most endowments are built through planned gifts, they stay around what they were originally.
And here's an instance, Jim, where I worked with a church in California where it had a separate incorporated board, and the vestry and the board had gone separate ways in terms of their mission,
Yeah.
basically. And the church received a large bequest, a $2 million bequest. They would not give it to the foundation because they didn't think the foundation was going to follow what they wanted to do. So they set up their own endowment. So this church has two endowment funds, one controlled by the vestry, one controlled by the separate board. And if you were in that church, what would you give to? And how would you explain that? Is it confusing?
So I want to, as we wrap up, open the floor still to questions. Ken and Lynn can certainly continue to answer questions. Let me just close just to remind everyone that we have recorded tonight's webinar, but all of the webinars which have taken place have been recorded. And they're all available on our Vital Practices website, which is listed there at the bottom of the screen, ecfvp.org, which is a place where you can get tremendous resources, both in leadership development, learning more about planned giving. There's even a donor webinar, which is noted there, so that if you have someone interested in giving a planned gift, you can simply send them a link on that website. There are some wonderful webinars that are coming up there, completely free to you. I would encourage you to register for them as soon as possible. They do fill up rather quickly. As you can see, one coming up on debt and using a capital campaign for debt, a very challenging issue, but one where there is tremendous opportunity as well. Working with your volunteers. This is one of our annual Giving Annual Stewardship webinars. Ken and Lynn will be back again on April the 9th to talk about spending rules, which is something they've just begun to talk about tonight, but it's a very important conversation because what you're trying to do is build trust and confidence among the members of your congregation so that they would be willing to make a gift. And of course, our capital campaign webinar, which you are also welcome to listen in on. There is a question out there about UpMiffle, and Ken, when you send me the links that we're going to send out to folks tomorrow when we send out the recording, can you please just send me the UpMiffle link, and we will send it out.
Repeat it here, Jim. You want to go to www.upmifa.org.
Why don't you type that out in the chat message while I just close up? So we are all at your service here at the Episcopal Church Foundation, regardless if you're looking for leadership resources or financial resources with help with building up your endowment through planned giving or through a capital campaign or helping you with your annual giving and annual stewardship. We are here to assist you. And I just want to sincerely thank Ken Quigley and Lynn Mander. You did a fine job tonight. Thank you, Lynn, for your first official national webinar. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And if you can, please listen to the recording again. Many times that can be quite helpful to hear all of this a second time. But please do let us know here at the Episcopal Church Foundation how we can support you. This is our goal, to empower you and to do the work that God's given you to do and to help you raise the financial resources to enable you to do all of those ministries. So please do be in contact. We look forward to helping you. Have a great evening.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I am